Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Find out how RANE can help you stay ahead of global events at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Ryan Bohl, in for Emily Donahue this week, here with Matt Orr to talk about his upcoming piece on Worldview that discusses the war in Ukraine. Thanks for joining me, Matt.
Hey Ryan, it's great to be here.
So let's start from the top. What is happening right now on the front lines? What's the tactical updates, and why have negotiations seemingly stopped between the two sides?
Yeah, I mean, the tactical situation on the ground is really fascinating. We've entered, we might not feel it yet, but we actually have entered a new phase of the war of a different magnitude, almost akin to when Russia withdrew its forces from the north of Ukraine. Basically, the front line has become very stagnant. The Russians conducted their offensive in the Donbass area, but basically that offensive ground to a halt. And then as the Ukrainians prepared their own counteroffensive in the Kherson area, Russia decided to disperse its troops that it had accumulated in the Donbass and essentially take a more defensive posture. The Russians have poured troops into the Kherson area, and that quickly kind of dispelled a lot of this talk of a Ukrainian counteroffensive that had started cropping up in the Western press. So that really looks outside of the cards right now as the Russians move to enforce that area very steadily. Basically, I think Russia's calculation was that they said, well, look, if the Ukrainians are going to, concentrate their forces so much to defend the Donbass, and if the Russians, despite their force concentration, couldn't make much progress there, the Russians basically, are going to try to call the Ukrainians bluff and say, okay, fine, then we'll actually continue to threaten your flanks and force the Ukrainians to call off any of their other initiatives. And now it's actually the Russians who are once again threatening these very important Ukrainian cities. In the south, of course, places like Mykolaiv. And then even in the north, there are fresh Russian troops that have been actually sitting in Russia and are leaving the Donbass and now are once again threatening other Ukrainian cities. Remaining Ukrainian forces in the Donbass in an uncomfortable position because they're not necessarily needed there at this time. But if they leave, then of course that puts this key area that Russia wants once again under the chopping block, so to speak. Regarding negotiations, the short answer to that is that both sides are not willing to make painful concessions at the negotiating table, and both sides appear to indicate that that their position will be strengthened as the conflict just continues on. And at this point, it's very clear that we are settling in for a years-long conflict, at least as it looks to me.
So if we're thinking about this in terms of a longer conflict, years long, as you said, what are some of the basic arguments that a lot of folks are making, or that you are making, about why a long-term conflict might actually favor Ukraine?
Yeah, that's the great question. You'll see versions of this argument, of course, within Ukraine and within the Western press, and that's very important for the Ukrainians, right? They need to have a vision of victory because they correctly assess that a lot of Western support is premised on not on just allowing a weakened Ukrainian state to survive, but for the Ukrainians to actually achieve something that can be called a strategic victory when all this ends. And there are several arguments that point to this possibility. The biggest among them is that now the Ukrainians are receiving a steady flow of NATO weaponry. Of course, that was not really the case before the war started, where Western military support for Kiev was rather minimal. It stepped up only in the weeks leading up to the invasion. Now we're seeing just an unprecedented level where we're seeing complex systems, artillery, things of that nature. Heavy equipment is coming in, and the thought is that with time, eventually, that NATO weaponry will give the Ukrainians enough firepower to not only deter further Russian attacks, but actually go on their own strategic counteroffensives. Of course, what will aid them in this is that Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly declined to declare more stringent mobilization measures and get more Russian soldiers to the front. A lot of people might not actually realize it, but Russia's biggest constraint right now continues to be a manpower shortage, not necessarily an equipment shortage. Although equipment is also a problem for them, they're economizing certain systems, and they're going to have to continue to do that, and that doesn't necessarily bode well for their ability to defend against an eventual Ukrainian counterattack if they're not willing to mobilize and get more troops to the front. The other key kind of element that the Ukrainians would cite in their favor is, of course, the Western sanctions on Russia. The hope is that, of course, if these sanctions have not done much, if at all, to damage Russia now or in the coming months, eventually, if we start talking into 2023, 2024, 2025, etc., the effect and damage of sanctions could cause enough damage to Russia's civilian and military economy to make the war less popular, unsustainable, etc. And of course, if Russian President Vladimir Putin's popularity and support for the war is falling, as it already is, then that could combine to create a window of opportunity for the Ukrainians where the Russians basically just say, well, the costs of continuing the war at its current stage are not worth it, and so that therefore we should de-escalate or leave Ukraine, leave parts of Ukraine, etc.
So that is kind of the argument for why this might favor the Ukrainians. But what's the opposite argument that a longer war actually favors the bigger country, Russia?
Yeah, I think that the argument that the long-term factors favor Russia is actually a little bit stronger, if not significantly stronger. We have to remember that the Ukrainians don't really have an ability to counterattack, to do meaningful counterattacks for the coming months. And there's a growing opinion that the front line is going to become increasingly stagnant. And if the front line becomes stagnant in its current place, as it looks quite likely, that's absolutely devastating for the Ukrainian economy. The current front lines, of course, give Russia control over the mouth of the Dnieper River and a long stretch of it. The Dnieper is so critical for the Ukraine's economy. It's a lifeblood that allows goods to come up the river towards Kiev, the capital, and of course downriver to be exported to international markets. And now Russia, controls that river, and that's so damaging for them. And so we have to remember that Russia is doing a lot of damage to Ukraine. The people are fleeing Ukraine. Ukraine's economy is supposed to contract by something like 30 to 40% this year. And if you have all these people leaving the country, then it's unclear how the country's economy can really recover in a meaningful way. That basically means that the Ukrainians are going to be beholden to Western military support, of course, and additionally financial support just to keep their country running in kind of a basic way and to prevent a complete collapse of living standards. And I think that the Russians' calculation is that when you combine with other factors contributing to war fatigue in the West, including their domestic political and economic problems in Europe and the United States, that a lot of Ukraine's Western backers will go, well, why are we spending so much of our resources to support the Ukrainians if our support will never actually allow them to get strong enough to change Russia's position at the negotiating table? And so this leads to a dynamic where I think that the Kremlin thinks that they can essentially take the gains that they have right now, hold out, and let time kind of work in their favor. So basically, the bottom line is that both sides seem to think that there is a way that the future will work out better for them. And what that really means for the near to midterm is that the conflict is definitely going to grind on. There was originally these hopes about some sort of a de-escalation starting this winter, but it appears to me that that's becoming increasingly unlikely.
Well, I'm sure you'll be keeping a close eye on both the tactical and the strategic developments of this ongoing war in Ukraine. Thanks for joining me, Matt. I'm Ryan Bohl. Thanks for listening.